I want you to just picture a scene for a second. One that's honestly pretty depressing.
Okay.
Imagine a cold, damp dungeon. It's dark. It smells terrible. And sitting there in chains is a man who was, he was essentially the rock star of his day, John the Baptist.
Yeah, this is the guy who drew massive crowds living out in the wilderness.
Exactly. He baptized Jesus himself, but now the party is definitely over. He's just rotting away in King Herod's prison, waiting to be executed.
It's such a stark contrast, isn't it? You go from the banks of the Jordan River with thousands of people, hanging on every word, to complete isolation, a hole in the ground.
Right. And in this moment of just total darkness, John does something that has, it's confused Christians for centuries. He sends his own disciples to find Jesus and ask a question that seems, it seems completely out of character. He asks, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?"
It's a really jarring moment. This is the man who saw the Spirit descend like a dove. He heard the voice of God from heaven.
This is my beloved son.
Exactly. And now, at the end of his life, he's asking, wait, are you sure?
That's it. And that is where we are starting today. We are doing a deep dive into a sermon called "Let Us Give Thanks to the Lord in Faith." And it focuses on this specific story in Matthew 11.
And I think we should say up front, the source material we're looking at, it doesn't just tweak the story.
No, it completely flips the script.
It really does. It challenges what you might call the standard narrative of John the Baptist. The source argues that the modern church has been infected, and that is the word they use, infected, by two major spiritual poisons.
Poisons is a really strong word. What are we talking about here?
So the first poison is the idea we just mentioned, that John the Baptist failed in his faith or that he doubted Jesus there in prison. The source says this is just dead wrong.
Okay, and the second?
The second one's even bigger. It claims there's a massive historical error in how we understand salvation itself, an error that, they argue, goes back 1,700 years.
Okay, we are definitely going to get into the history because the source starts throwing punches at some very, very famous figures.
Oh, yeah.
But let's stick with John for a second because, look, I've heard this story 100 times. The takeaway is always, even great men of God have bad days. He was human, he was suffering, he cracked. And honestly, I always found that relatable.
It is relatable. We like the idea that even our heroes struggle. But the source argues that this interpretation is actually a wrong prejudice. They say it attacks the integrity of John the Baptist.
So what's their argument?
Their argument is that John didn't doubt, not for a split second. He knew exactly who Jesus was.
But if he knew, why send the message? Why ask, "Are you the one?" If I know you're the expert, I don't send you an email asking, "Are you sure you know what you're talking about?" Unless, I'm doubting you.
That's where the strategy comes in. You have to look at John's situation. He knew he was about to be beheaded. He publicly called out King Herod for sleeping with his brother's wife.
Right.
John knew how that movie was going to end. So he wasn't worried about his own soul. He was worried about his disciples.
His disciples, the guys who were still following John.
Exactly. Even though Jesus won the scene, John still had this loyal following. They were hanging around the prison, maybe hoping John would get out and restart the revival. As long as John was alive, they were just glued to him.
Ah, I see. So it's a loyalty issue. They didn't want to leave their leader.
Right. So the source argues that John needed to cut the cord. He sent them to Jesus with that question, "Are you the one?" Not because he needed the answer, but because he needed his disciples to hear it directly from Jesus.
It was a handoff.
It was a handoff. He was guiding his followers to their new master, entrusting them to the Lamb of God before he was executed.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. It changes it from a moment of weakness to, a moment of really high-level leadership. He's making sure his people are taken care of.
And the source points out that Jesus confirms this. This is a detail I think a lot of people just gloss over. After John's messengers leave, Jesus turns to the crowd.
Who are probably thinking, wow, John is losing it.
Exactly. And he defends John passionately. He asks them, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind."
A reed swayed by the wind. I love that phrase, but let's unpack it. What's he actually implying?
Well, a reed is flimsy. It bends whichever way the wind blows. It's a metaphor for someone who is unstable, someone who changes their mind based on hardship. Jesus is asking, did you go out to see a guy who flip-flops?
And the implied answer is no.
No. And then Jesus drops the ultimate verdict. He says, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist.
Okay, hold on. This is where the source makes a really huge leap that I want to drill down into. Greater than anyone born of women. That puts John above Abraham, Moses, King David, Isaiah, everyone.
Everyone.
Why? Was John just holier? Did he pray more? Was he just a better person?
No. And this is the most critical distinction the source makes. It's not about his personality or his piety. It's about his office, his role.
His office.
The source argues John is the greatest because he is the appointed representative of humanity.
Representative of humanity. That sounds like a diplomatic title, like he's an ambassador.
That is a great way to think about it. Imagine a diplomat signing a treaty. When that representative signs, he's not just signing for himself.
He's signing for the entire nation.
His action counts for everyone. The source argues John the Baptist held that exact position for the entire human race.
But who gave him that title? I mean, you can't just declare yourself the representative of humanity.
Well, to understand that, we have to go deep into the Old Testament, specifically the lineage of the high priests. The source emphasizes a biological fact that gets overlooked. John was the son of Zechariah.
Zechariah was a priest.
Yes, specifically of the division of Abijah. He was a descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses. This means John the Baptist was born into the Levitical priesthood.
So he was spiritual royalty in a sense.
And crucially, the last high priest of the Old Testament era.
Why does that matter so much? I mean, okay, so he has a priestly pedigree. Why is that essential to the gospel?
Because of how sin was handled in the Old Testament. This is where we need to slow down and look at the sort of mechanics. In Leviticus 16, on the Day of Atonement,
Yom Kippur.
right, how are the sins of the people taken away?
They sacrificed animals.
They did, but there was a very specific step before the animal was killed. The high priest would take a live goat, the scapegoat, and he would lay his hands on its head.
The laying on of hands, I've seen that in church when people pray for each other.
But in the Old Testament, it was more than just a prayer. It was a legal transfer. The text says the high priest would confess over the goat all the iniquities of the people of Israel. By laying his hands on the head, the sin was physically, spiritually, legally. It was moved from the people to the goat.
So it's like a data transfer.
Yeah.
Or like moving a debt from one bank account to another.
Precisely. Once the hands were laid, the people were clean, and the goat was now carrying the sin. Then it was sent away or killed. But that transfer, the laying on of hands, was the prerequisite. Without it, a goat is just a goat.
I think I see where this is going. The source is saying John isn't just some prophet shouting in the desert. He's the high priest. And Jesus is.
The Lamb of God, the scapegoat.
So when they meet in the Jordan River.
It's not a ceremony. It's not just Jesus showing humility. The source argues that the baptism of Jesus was the modern fulfillment of the Day of Atonement. When John put his hands on Jesus' head in the water, that was the moment.
The specific split second.
The specific split second in history, where all the sins of the world were transferred from humanity, represented by John, onto Jesus.
Wow. That's mechanical. It's almost like theological physics.
It is theological physics, and the source quotes Matthew 3.15 to back this up. Remember what Jesus said when John tried to stop him?
Right. John says, I shouldn't baptize you.
And Jesus says, let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness.
Fulfill all righteousness. I've always just read that as, let's do the right thing.
The source interprets all righteousness much more literally. It means to complete the requirements of the law, to make things right. They argue that if John hadn't baptized Jesus, the sin would never have been transferred. Jesus could have died on the cross, but he wouldn't have been carrying the world's sin.
So if you follow this logic, the baptism is just as important as the cross.
Inseparable, according to the source. They call it the gospel of the water and the Spirit. The water is the baptism, the transfer of sin. The Spirit is Jesus being God. And the cross is the payment for that sin.
You need the transfer and the payment.
You need both.
Okay, this brings us to that second poison the source talks about. Because honestly, I have been to a lot of churches, I have heard a lot of sermons, and I rarely, if ever, hear the baptism explained as a transfer of sin.
Right, it's usually about new life, a symbol.
Exactly. So if this is so central, why isn't everyone talking about it?
That is the big question. And the source has a very specific villain in this story. They point the finger directly at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325.
Whoa, wait a minute. The Council of Nicaea. We're talking about the foundation of Orthodox Christianity here, the Nicene Creed.
The Nicene Creed itself.
It's recited in millions of churches every Sunday. You're telling me the source claims the creed is wrong.
They argue it's fatally incomplete. Think about what the creed says. It summarizes Jesus' life. Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried.
It skips the baptism.
It jumps straight from his birth to his death. It completely omits his ministry and, crucially, the baptism by John.
Wow.
The source calls this a spiritual poison because by removing the baptism from the core statement of faith, the church effectively lost sight of the moment sin was transferred.
So the argument is that Constantine and those bishops, by editing out the baptism, basically hid the mechanism of salvation from everybody.
That's the claim. And the source argues that the fallout from this has been, well, devastating. They describe the modern Christian experience as a cycle of sinning and regretting.
What does that mean, sinning and regretting?
Well, think about the average believer. They believe Jesus died from them. They believe in the cross. But they still feel guilty. They still feel like they have sin in their hearts. The source argues this is because they only believe in the payment, the blood, but they haven't accepted the transfer of the water.
That is a heavy accusation. They're basically saying you feel guilty because you don't realize your debt was actually moved off your books.
Exactly. The source is very provocative here. There's a line where they claim that pastors who don't teach the baptism are deceived and are leading their congregations to remain sinners.
Because if you only believe in the cross, your sins weren't legally transferred, so they are still on you.
That's the logic. It's like, let's go back to your debt analogy. It's like believing the bank has the money to pay off your mortgage, but you never signed the paper to transfer the mortgage to the bank.
That's a perfect analogy. The cross is the check that pays the debt. But the baptism was the signature that transferred the debt to Jesus. If you don't have this signature, the check is worthless.
The check pays nothing.
Man, when you put it that way, you can see why the source is so intense about this. It's not just some minor theological debate to them. It's the difference between being saved and being lost.
Right. And this intensity leads us to another really fascinating interpretation of the text, how they read Matthew 11:12.
Oh yeah, the violence verse. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. That has always sounded so aggressive to me. It's talking about, like, literal war, persecution.
The source takes a completely different angle. They say this isn't about swords or suffering. It's about spiritual aggression against tradition.
Taking heaven by force means fighting tradition.
Think about it. If the source is right, then for 1,700 years, since the Nicene Creed, the tradition has been to ignore the baptism. That is a massive river of history flowing in one direction. To stand up and say, no, I need the water and the blood, requires force. It requires a kind of violence.
It requires the force to say, my grandmother's church might have missed something, or the great theologians might have overlooked this.
Exactly. It's the violence of breaking a habit.
Yeah.
It's that internal struggle to reject the status quo and claim your own sinlessness. The source says taking it by force means aggressively slanting the fact that you have absolutely no sin because John put it on Jesus.
Regardless of what your feelings or your traditions tell you.
Right. It really paints faith not as this passive, gentle thing, but as a battle for truth against error.
It fits with their whole worldview. They see this gospel of the water and the spirit as an antidote. They frame the current state of Christianity as being poisoned by the idea that John failed and poisoned by the omission of the baptism. So the believer has to essentially fight their way out of that confusion.
Yeah.
So let's zoom out for a second. We've gone from a dungeon in Judea to the ancient priesthood, all the way to the Council of Nicaea. The source is weaving a very, very tight narrative here, and everything hinges on John the Baptist.
It really does. If you remove John's role as the high priest, the whole argument just collapses.
Yeah.
If he's just a guy in the desert, the baptism is just a ceremony.
But if he's the representative of humanity...
If you accept that premise, then the baptism becomes the linchpin of the entire Bible.
It's interesting because it forces you to look at the Bible as a single machine. Like all these parts, Aaron, the goats, the river, the cross, they aren't random, they're gears.
And the source suggests that for centuries, the church has been trying to run this machine with a missing gear. Or, to use a different image they bring up, think of a bridge.
A bridge.
Imagine a bridge that needs 2 pillars to cross a wide river. The source argues the 2 pillars of salvation are the baptism, the water, and the cross, the blood.
Okay, I'm with you.
The church has built the cross pillar beautifully. It's massive, it's strong. But the source argues they never built the baptism pillar. They just ignored it. And if you try to build a bridge on just one pillar,
It falls into the river. You can't cross.
Precisely. You can't get to the other side. You can't get to true sinlessness without both.
That is a vivid image to leave on. The idea that for, centuries, We've been trying to bridge the gap between man and God with only half the structure.
It forces you to look at the text of Matthew 11, again with fresh eyes. When you read about John in prison now, through this lens, you don't see a broken, depressed man who failed.
No. You see a man who knows he finished the job, he transferred the sin, he handed off the baton, and he's just tying up loose ends with his disciples before he goes.
It certainly gives a lot more dignity to John the Baptist, and honestly, it places a lot more responsibility on the believer. How? Because it challenges you to not just be a passive listener. It challenges you to ask, do I understand why things happen in the Bible? Why the water? Why the hands? Or am I just accepting the summary I was told?
That's the scary part, right? The idea that you could be sincere, you could be faithful, but you could be missing a key piece of the puzzle because you never asked why.
In this source's view, the details aren't just trivia. The details are the difference between carrying your sin and having it taken away.
Heavy stuff, but fascinating to unpack.
Always.
So here is our final thought for you to chew on. The source talks a lot about the water and the spirit, but I want you to think about that phrase, taking heaven by force. Regardless of where you land on the theology, there's something compelling about the idea that truth isn't something that just drifts into your lap.
Yeah.
You have to grab it. You have to be willing to look at a verse you've read 100 times, like the story of John's baptism, and ask, wait, what is actually happening here?
And are you willing to break with tradition if the text points you somewhere else? That's the real challenge.
Exactly. So go read Matthew 11, read Leviticus 16 if you're feeling brave, and ask yourself, why did Jesus say that baptism was fitting to fulfill all righteousness? Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.